The silence was wrong. Master Chief Petty Officer Dex Rourke had spent enough years in hostile territory to know when quiet meant death was coming. Through his night vision goggles, the Afghan mountainside stretched endlessly white, unmarked except for the blood trail leading to their position. His team of 8 Navy SEALs had been pinned down for 6 hours in a shallow depression, barely deep enough to hide their bodies from the Taliban fighters who owned these peaks. "Overwatch, this is Viper 7, Rourke whispered into his radio, breath forming crystals in the -20 air. "We have multiple KIA, running low on ammo and enemy forces closing from 3 directions. Request immediate close air support." The response crackled through static. "Viper 7, this is Overwatch. All fixed-wing assets are grounded due to weather. Storm system extends to 30,000 feet. We're looking for alternatives." Alternatives. Rourke almost laughed, but the sound would carry too far in the thin air. They were trapped at 11,000 feet on the wrong side of the Hindu Kush, surrounded by fighters who knew every stone, every shadow. His men had been tracking a high-value target when the ambush hit, a coordinated attack that spoke of intelligence leaks and careful planning. Now 3 of his SEALs lay motionless in the snow, their tactical vests slowly disappearing under fresh powder. Petty Officer First Class Miguel Santos crawled closer, his rifle barrel frosted white. Movement, 2 o'clock. At least 15 fighters moving through the tree line. The Taliban were patient hunters. They'd wait for dawn, then close the trap when the Americans' night vision advantage disappeared. Standard mountain warfare. Use the terrain, use the weather, wait for the enemy to make mistakes born of desperation. "Sir," came another whisper, this time from Petty Officer Jackson, their youngest operator. "I'm seeing heat signatures on thermal. They're setting up mortars about 800 meters east." Rourke felt the familiar weight of command settling deeper on his shoulders. Every decision now meant life or death, not just for him, but for the men who'd followed him into this frozen hell. The storm wasn't just grounding their air support, it was giving their enemies the perfect cover to maneuver. Then, impossibly, through the howling wind came a sound that shouldn't exist. Low, guttural, mechanical. The unmistakable growl of jet engines cutting through the blizzard like a chainsaw through silk. The growing thunder made every SEAL lift their heads from the snow, hope flickering in eyes that had already started planning final stands. Whatever was coming through, that storm wasn't supposed to be there. But it was coming anyway. Captain Thea Reaper, Konstantinova had been flying the A-10C Thunderbolt II for 8 years, but she'd never pushed the Warthog through weather like this. At 28,000 feet, the storm was a living thing, violent updrafts that tried to flip her aircraft inverted, ice forming so fast on her wings that the de-icing systems couldn't keep pace. Her heads-up display flickered between green and red warnings, altitude and airspeed readings jumping erratically as the storm played havoc with her instruments. "Reaper, this is Overwatch," came the voice through her headset, barely audible over the static. "Be advised, weather minimums are showing 0-0 conditions throughout your operational area. Recommend immediate RTB. Return to base." The safe call. The smart call. Thea glanced at her fuel gauge, enough for another 45 minutes of flight time, maybe less if she had to fight the storm much longer. Her hands moved automatically over the controls, adjusting trim tabs and power settings to keep the 30-ton aircraft stable in air that wanted to tear it apart. "Overwatch, Reaper," she replied, her voice steady despite the turbulence that was trying to rattle her teeth loose. "Negative on RTB. I have troops in contact requesting immediate close air support. 8 souls on the ground." The silence on the radio stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd lost communication entirely. Then, "Reaper, we have no other assets in the area. Visibility is less than 50 feet. This is a suicide mission." Thea had heard that before. 8 months ago, when her forward operating base had been overrun, and she'd been the only pilot crazy enough to fly night missions through rocket fire, to keep the evacuation routes open. 6 months ago, when her squadron commander had told her that women didn't have the physical strength for close air support missions. 3 months ago, when her own wingman had questioned whether someone with her background issues could handle the pressure of ground troops depending on her decisions. She'd proven them wrong every time, but the whispers followed her like contrails. Too aggressive, too emotional, too willing to take risks that endangered expensive aircraft for soldiers who were probably dead already anyway. Copy Overwatch. Reaper is proceeding to target area. Through her canopy, the world was white chaos. No horizon, no ground reference points, just swirling snow that made her instruments the only truth in a universe gone mad. But somewhere below in that frozen wasteland, 8 Navy SEALs were counting on her to find them before the Taliban did. The A-10 bucked and shuddered as another gust tried to slam her into a mountain she couldn't see. Thea's hands never wavered on the stick. The first challenge was finding them. Thea descended through 12,000 feet of storm, her aircraft's terrain following radar, painting a green maze of peaks and valleys on her multifunction display. The A-10 wasn't designed for this kind of weather flying. It was built to loiter over battlefields in clear skies, delivering precise fire support to troops who could see their targets. Flying blind through a blizzard was like performing surgery with a sledgehammer. Viper 7, this is Reaper. I'm showing your GPS coordinates, but I need TalkOn for visual identification. What's your situation? Master Chief Rourke's voice came through the radio like salvation wrapped in static. Reaper, Viper 7. We are in a shallow depression, approximately 200 meters south of a burned-out compound. Enemy forces are moving on our position from multiple directions. We have 3 KIA, 2 wounded, running critically low on ammunition. Thea banked the A-10 into a wide orbit, descending to 8,000 feet. At this altitude, she was flying inside the cloud deck, visibility dropping to near zero. Her targeting pod swept back and forth across the mountainside, the infrared camera showing nothing but white static punctuated by the occasional rock outcropping. Viper 7, I need you to mark your position. Do you have strobes? Negative on strobes, Reaper. IR signatures would give away our position to enemy forces. Can you work with GPS coordinates only? Working with GPS coordinates only, in a blizzard, with enemy forces in close proximity to friendly forces. It was every close air support pilot's nightmare scenario. One mistake, one miscalculation, and she'd be dropping ordnance on the men she was trying to save. Copy Viper 7. Stand by for gun run, danger close. Thea rolled the A-10 into a steep dive, descending to 4,000 feet above the valley floor. The storm was worse here, wind shear threatening to slam her into the mountainside she couldn't see. Her hands worked the controls with precision born of thousands of hours in the cockpit, making minute adjustments to keep the aircraft stable as she lined up for her first attack run. On her targeting display, she could finally make out heat signatures moving through the snow, dark shapes that had to be the Taliban fighters closing on the SEAL position. But without visual confirmation, without clear separation between friendly and enemy forces, she was shooting blind into a situation where inches might mean the difference between salvation and massacre. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon in her aircraft's nose held 1,174 rounds of 30-depleted uranium ammunition. Each round could punch through armored vehicles, reduce buildings to rubble, turn human beings into mist. In the right hands, it was precision incarnate. In the wrong situation, it was indiscriminate death. Thea had never fired danger close in zero visibility before. Neither had any pilot she'd ever known. Viper 7, Reaper is inbound. Keep your heads down. The first burst from the GAU-8 cannon sounded like the world ending. 2 seconds of fire, 60 rounds of 30 ammunition screaming through the blizzard at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The A-10 shuddered as the massive cannon cycled, the recoil so violent it actually slowed the aircraft's forward motion. Through the snow and static, Thea heard Master Chief Rourke's voice. "Good hits, Reaper. Enemy forces pulling back from our northern perimeter, but we've got more movement to the east, approximately 300 meters." She banked hard left, pulling the A-10 into another attack run. At this altitude, in this weather, she was flying on instruments and instinct. The targeting pod showed thermal signatures moving through the trees, but the resolution was too poor to distinguish between armed fighters and fleeing civilians. She had seconds to decide whether to engage. Viper 7, can you confirm eastern movement is hostile? Affirm, Reaper, taking effective fire from that position. They've got at least 2 machine gun nests set up in the tree line. The decision made itself. Thea lined up the shot, compensating for wind drift and the aircraft's motion through the storm. The GAU-8 spoke again, 60 more rounds chewing through trees and snow and whatever lay hidden beneath. Direct hit, Reaper, eastern machine gun position neutralized. You just saved our asses. But saving them once wasn't enough. Through her headset, she could hear the strain in the SEAL team leader's voice, the carefully controlled urgency of men who knew they were still dying by degrees. The storm wasn't letting up. If anything, it was getting worse, visibility dropping to the point where she was flying more by feel than by sight. Viper 7, what's your status on wounded? Can you move? Negative movement, Reaper. Petty Officer Martinez took shrapnel in the leg, and Jackson's got a shoulder wound that's bleeding pretty bad. We're not going anywhere fast, and the enemy knows it. The Taliban fighters were pulling back, regrouping, waiting for the storm to ground her permanently or force her to return to base for fuel. They could afford to wait. Time was on their side, along with the weather, the terrain, and the simple mathematics of ammunition expenditure. Thea checked her fuel gauge. 30 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe less. She wasn't leaving, not yet. The radio crackled with a new voice, authoritative, annoyed, demanding immediate compliance. "Reaper, this is Colonel Harrison, Mission Commander. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Weather conditions have deteriorated beyond acceptable limits." Thea knew Colonel Harrison's reputation. A career officer who'd flown transport missions during the Gulf War but had never been shot at, never had troops depending on his split-second decisions. He understood policy and procedures, risk management and acceptable losses. What he didn't understand was the sound of dying men calling for help through a radio. "Colonel, this is Reaper. I have troops in contact requesting immediate assistance. Mission is not complete. Captain Konstantinova, you will comply with direct orders and return to base. We have other assets being prepared for dispatch once weather conditions improve." Other assets, once weather conditions improved. The colonel was talking about hours, maybe days. The SEALs had minutes, maybe less. "Sir, respectfully, there are no other assets capable of reaching this location in current conditions. 8 Navy SEALs are about to be overrun by superior enemy forces." The pause stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd finally crossed the line from aggressive to insubordinate. Then Colonel Harrison's voice came back, cold and final. "Captain, you are relieved of this mission. Return to base immediately or face court-martial proceedings." Thea looked down through the storm at the mountainside where 8 men were bleeding into the snow, counting their remaining ammunition 1 round at a time. Men who'd trusted that when they called for help, help would come. Men who'd never asked her gender, never questioned her background, never wondered if she had the right temperament for the job. She reached over and turned off her radio. The silence in her cockpit was profound, broken only by the steady hum of engines and the whisper of wind across her canopy. For the first time in her military career, Captain Thea Konstantinova was completely alone with her choices. No commanding officers, no mission controllers, no voices telling her what she could and couldn't do. Below her, Invisible through the storm, Master Chief Rourke was probably wondering why the radio had gone quiet. His men were probably checking their ammunition, making peace with whatever gods watched over warriors in their final moments. The Taliban fighters were probably moving closer, sensing weakness, preparing for the final assault. She had 27 minutes of fuel remaining. Thea pushed the A-10 into another attack run, this time descending to just 2,000 feet above the valley floor. At this altitude, she could barely pull out of a dive if she hit an unexpected downdraft. The mountains around her were invisible, lurking like sleeping giants ready to swat her aircraft from the sky. Her altimeter was the only thing standing between controlled flight and becoming a crater in the snow. Through her targeting pod, she could see new thermal signatures moving through the storm. More Taliban fighters, reinforcements arriving to finish what the ambush had started. They were being methodical about it, setting up firing positions that would give them clear fields of fire once they began the final assault. The GAU-8 cannon cycled again, spitting death through the blizzard with mechanical precision. But this time, something went wrong. The aircraft shuddered differently, and warning lights began flashing across her instrument panel. Engine temperature rising rapidly on the left side, oil pressure dropping. She'd taken a hit, probably small arms fire from one of the Taliban positions, lucky shot through the storm that found something vital. The A-10 was famously tough, designed to absorb punishment and keep flying, but every aircraft had its limits. "Come on, girl," Thea whispered to her aircraft, monitoring the engine parameters as they crept deeper into the red zone. "Just give me 10 more minutes." The left engine was dying, oil pressure dropping toward zero. In clear weather over friendly territory, it would be a manageable emergency. Single engine flight back to base, routine landing, write up the maintenance discrepancy, and let the crew chiefs figure out what needed fixing. But she wasn't over friendly territory, and the weather wasn't clear. Flying a damaged aircraft through a blizzard with mountains on all sides was a death sentence with wings. She had a choice to make, and she had to make it now. Master Chief Rourke heard the change in the A-10's engine note before he saw the aircraft emerge from the storm clouds like some prehistoric predator. The Warthog was flying lower than any sane pilot would attempt in these conditions, barely clearing the ridgeline, trailing black smoke from its left engine. "Jesus Christ," whispered Petty Officer Santos, "she's going to crash." But the aircraft didn't crash. Instead, it lined up for another gun run, this one so low that Rourke could actually see the pilot's helmet through the cockpit canopy as she flashed overhead. The GAU-8 cannon fired in controlled bursts, walking death across Taliban positions with surgical precision, despite the damaged aircraft's obvious instability. "All Viper 7 elements, this is the Master Chief," Rourke called over the team radio. "Whoever that pilot is, she's buying us time with her life. Make every round count." The SEALs opened fire with their remaining ammunition, coordinating their shots with the A-10's attack runs. It was barely controlled chaos, wounded men firing through blinding snow at an enemy they could barely see, supported by a pilot flying a dying aircraft through conditions that should have been impossible. But it was working. The Taliban fighters were falling back, their coordinated assault disrupted by the unexpected ferocity of the defense. Bodies lay scattered in the snow where the A-10's cannon had found its mark, and the survivors were losing their taste for martyrdom in the face of such overwhelming firepower. "Reaper, this is Viper 7, Rourke called, not sure if the pilot could even hear him over the storm and her aircraft's mechanical problems. "Outstanding work. Enemy forces are withdrawing. Can you maintain station?" The response came through heavy static, the pilot's voice strained but determined. "Viper 7, negative on extended station time. Aircraft damage is severe, but I'm not leaving until you're safe." Rourke felt something tighten in his chest. He'd served with brave men, had seen heroism under fire more times than he could count. But this was different. This pilot, this woman, he realized from the voice, was willing to die to keep 8 strangers alive. Not for glory, not for medals, but because it was the right thing to do. Reaper, what's your fuel state? 15 minutes remaining, maybe less with the engine damage. 15 minutes. Enough time for one, maybe 2 more attack runs before she'd be forced to attempt an emergency landing somewhere in the Hindu Kush. The chances of surviving such a landing in a damaged aircraft, in a blizzard, were essentially zero. The radio crackled with a new transmission, this one on the emergency frequency. Any station, this is Reaper. Mayday, mayday. Single engine failure attempting emergency landing. GPS coordinates follow. She was giving her position so that recovery teams could find her body. Thea Konstantinova had always known she would die in an aircraft. From the moment she'd first strapped into the cockpit of a T-6 Texan trainer as a flight student, she'd understood that flying military jets was a profession with an unusually high mortality rate. What she hadn't expected was that it would happen like this, alone, in a storm, over hostile territory, with no witnesses except enemy fighters and 8 Navy SEALs she'd never met. The A-10's left engine finally seized completely, temperature gauges pegging at maximum readings before the automatic shutdown systems killed power to prevent a fire. The aircraft immediately began pulling to the left, requiring constant right rudder pressure to maintain anything resembling controlled flight. Her airspeed was bleeding off rapidly, and she could feel the Warthog starting to mush through the air as it approached stall speed. She had maybe 5 minutes of controlled flight remaining. Through her targeting pod, she could see the Taliban fighters regrouping for one final push against the SEAL position. They knew the American air support was crippled, knew this was their last chance to overrun the depression where 8 men waited with empty magazines and wounded friends. Thea armed her remaining ordnance, 2 AGM-65 Maverick missiles and a single CBU-97 cluster bomb. Enough firepower to break the enemy assault, if she could position the aircraft for accurate delivery. But flying a crippled A-10 through a precision attack run was like threading a needle while riding a mechanical bull. The first Maverick missile flew true, its infrared seeker locking onto the heat signature of a Taliban machine gun position. The explosion bloomed orange through the falling snow, silencing the weapon that had been preparing to rake the SEAL position with enfilading fire. Banking hard right to line up for her second shot, Thea felt the aircraft shudder as it approached the edge of unrecoverable flight. The stall warning horn was screaming in her headset, altitude dropping rapidly as the damaged A-10 fought to stay airborne. She had one chance to deliver the cluster bomb accurately before physics took over and turned her into a passenger rather than a pilot. The CBU-97 released cleanly, its submunitions spreading across the mountainside in a pattern of destruction that caught the remaining Taliban fighters in the open. Through the storm, she could see secondary explosions as ammunition caches and improvised explosive devices detonated in chain reactions. Reaper, this is Viper 7, Master Chief Rourke's voice came through her headset, excitement barely contained. Outstanding. Enemy forces are broken and retreating. You did it. But Thea wasn't listening to congratulations anymore. The A-10 was falling out of the sky, single engine unable to maintain altitude in the thin mountain air. Her altimeter was unwinding rapidly, terrain warning screaming as invisible peaks reached up through the storm to claim her aircraft. She had perhaps 90 seconds before impact. The emergency procedures were burned into her memory through countless hours of simulator training. Maintain best glide speed, attempt engine restart, prepare for forced landing, transmit final position report. All the steps that might save her life if she were flying over Kansas farmland instead of the Hindu Kush mountains. Mayday, mayday, this is Reaper. Aircraft is going down approximately 2 miles north of Viper 7 position. Single engine failure, attempting emergency landing. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd saved 8 Navy SEALs who were trained for exactly this kind of survival situation, and now she was about to become the one who needed rescuing. If she survived the crash landing, if the aircraft didn't break apart on impact, if she wasn't captured by the same Taliban fighters she'd been killing for the past hour. Too many ifs, not enough altitude. Through the storm, she caught a glimpse of a small plateau, maybe 300 meters long, covered in snow, with a relatively gentle slope. It wasn't much, but it was the best she was going to get. Thea lined up the dying A-10 for what would almost certainly be her final approach to any runway. The impact came faster than expected. The A-10 hit the snow-covered plateau at 140 knots, far too fast for any reasonable chance of survival. The landing gear had been retracted, turning the fuselage into a giant sled that gouged through the frozen ground, throwing up geysers of snow and rock, and sparks from metal scraping against stone. For 10 seconds that felt like hours, Thea was just along for the ride as 30 tons of aircraft fought physics and lost. The cockpit filled with the sound of tearing metal and breaking glass. Warning lights flashed and died as electrical systems failed in cascading sequence. The ejection seat tried to fire but couldn't penetrate the crushed canopy frame. Then, impossibly, everything stopped. Thea hung in her restraints, suspended upside down in what remained of her cockpit. Blood ran from her forehead into her helmet, and her left arm felt wrong in ways that suggested multiple fractures. But she was alive, conscious, and the aircraft wasn't on fire. Yet, the smell of jet fuel was strong, and she could hear the ominous tick-tick-tick of hot metal cooling in the snow. The A-10 had come to rest inverted, its back broken, wings twisted at impossible angles. It would never fly again, but it had protected her through the crash with the same stubborn durability that had kept it flying through the storm. Moving carefully, testing each limb before trusting it with her weight, Thea began the process of extracting herself from the wreckage. The cockpit canopy was gone, shattered into a million pieces scattered across the plateau. Her survival radio was still clipped to her vest, crackling with transmissions she couldn't quite understand through the ringing in her ears. She was alive, injured, stranded, and surrounded by hostile forces in one of the most remote locations on Earth, but alive. And 8 Navy SEALs were safe because of what she'd done. That had to count for something. The first indication that Master Chief Rourke wasn't going to abandon her came 20 minutes after the crash, when his voice broke through the static on her survival radio. "Reaper, this is Viper 7. Transmit your position. We're coming for you." Thea almost laughed, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her ribs. "Viper 7, negative. You have wounded personnel and limited ammunition. Mission priority is your own extraction." "Reaper, with respect, fuck the mission priorities. You just saved 8 American lives. We don't leave people behind." She understood then why Navy SEALs had the reputation they did. Not because they were superhuman warriors, but because they possessed something rarer than tactical skill or physical conditioning. The absolute certainty that no sacrifice was too great if it meant bringing their people home. But the reality was brutal. She was approximately 2 miles from the SEAL position, across terrain controlled by Taliban fighters who were undoubtedly converging on her crash site. The weather was still deteriorating, visibility near zero, temperatures dropping toward levels that would kill exposed personnel within hours. "Viper 7, I'm transmitting GPS coordinates, but don't be stupid about this. You've got wounded men who need medical attention." "Copy coordinates, Reaper. Be advised, we've got company inbound. Estimate 20 to 30 enemy fighters moving toward your position from the south. They know where you are." Of course they did. The crash had been visible for miles, a pillar of smoke and steam rising from the plateau like a beacon for every hostile force in the valley. They would come to capture the American pilot, to parade her before cameras as proof of their victory over the world's most powerful military. Thea checked her sidearm, a 9 Beretta with 2 magazines. 46 rounds total, if she'd counted correctly. Not much for a last stand, but enough to ensure she wouldn't be taken alive if it came to that. The sound of approaching vehicles came through the storm like distant thunder. Motorcycles and small trucks, moving fast across terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain drivers. They were taking risks to reach her quickly, knowing that American rescue forces would eventually respond to her Mayday calls. Viper 7, enemy forces are approximately 10 minutes from my position. Recommend you maintain your current location and wait for proper extraction assets. Master Chief Rourke's response was immediate. Negative, Reaper. We're moving to your position now. ETA 15 minutes. They were going to try. 8 Navy SEALs, 3 of them wounded, all of them low on ammunition, were going to attempt a rescue mission across hostile territory in zero visibility conditions. It was tactically insane, strategically questionable, and personally stupid. It was also exactly what she would have done. The Taliban fighters reached her crash site first. Thea watched through her rifle scope as dark figures emerged from the storm, moving cautiously toward the wreckage of her aircraft. They were being smart about it, assuming she was armed and dangerous, setting up a perimeter before attempting to close the distance. She counted 12 fighters in the first wave, all carrying AK-47 assault rifles, several with rocket-propelled grenades slung across their backs. Professional soldiers, not the amateur militia she'd been expecting. These men knew how to move, how to communicate, how to coordinate their actions despite the challenging conditions. From her position behind a large boulder about 50 meters from the crash site, Thea had clear fields of fire in 3 directions. The 4th direction led up a steep slope toward the ridgeline, her only potential escape route if things went badly. The first Taliban fighter reached the aircraft wreckage, calling out in Pashto as he approached the empty cockpit. When no response came, he gestured for his companions to move closer. They were being methodical, professional, taking their time to ensure the American pilot wasn't waiting in ambush. Smart tactics, but not smart enough. Thea's first shot took the point man's center mass, dropping him beside the twisted remains of her ejection seat. Her second shot caught another fighter who was trying to reach cover behind the aircraft's wing. The surviving Taliban soldiers immediately went to ground, shouting orders and trying to identify her position through the falling snow. But she was already moving, using terrain and weather to break contact, falling back toward the ridgeline as bullets cracked through the air where she'd been hiding seconds earlier. The Taliban fighters had superior numbers and local knowledge, but she had something more valuable: the desperate certainty that dying on her feet was better than whatever they had planned for captured American pilots. The firefight lasted 23 minutes. Later, when after-action reports were written and lessons learned were documented, military analysts would study the engagement as an example of how proper training and superior marksmanship could overcome numerical disadvantage. But for Thea, crouched behind inadequate cover while enemy bullets shattered rocks around her position, it was simply about staying alive long enough for help to arrive. If help was actually coming. She was down to her last magazine when the sound of American weapons joined the firefight. M4 carbines and squad automatic weapons, firing in controlled bursts that spoke of professional soldiers with proper training and unlimited confidence in their abilities. The Taliban fighters, caught between Thea's position and the approaching SEALs, suddenly found themselves fighting a two-front battle in conditions that favored neither side. "Reaper, this is Viper 7, Master Chief Rourke's voice came through her radio between bursts of gunfire. "We have visual on your position. Keep your head down." The rescue was violent, efficient, and over quickly. 8 Navy SEALs, moving with the coordinated precision of men who had trained together for years, swept through the Taliban positions like a force of nature. When the shooting stopped, 12 enemy fighters lay dead in the snow, and one wounded American pilot was being carried towards safety on an improvised stretcher. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Reaper," Petty Officer Santos grinned as he checked her injuries. "Hell of a way to make an entrance." Thea looked back at the smoking remains of her A-10, then at the faces of the men who'd risked everything to reach her. Men who barely knew her name but had treated her life as precious as their own. "Next time," she whispered, "I'm requesting easier coordinates." Master Chief Rourke laughed, but his eyes were serious. "Ma'am, after what you did today, you can request whatever you want. We owe you." But as they began the long journey back through the storm toward their original position, Thea knew the debt ran both ways. These men had reminded her why she joined the military in the first place, not for glory or advancement or to prove anything to anyone, but because some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth saving. The extraction took 14 hours. 14 hours of moving through terrain that belonged to the enemy, carrying wounded personnel, navigating by compass and GPS through weather that grounded every other aircraft in the theater. By the time the rescue helicopters finally reached them, the storm had blown itself out, and the sun was breaking through the clouds for the first time in 3 days. Thea was unconscious by then, blood loss and exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline that had kept her moving. She woke up 6 days later in a military hospital in Germany, her left arm in a cast, and a Purple Heart on her bedside table that she didn't remember anyone mentioning. The first visitor she received wasn't from her squadron, wasn't from the hospital staff, wasn't from the military bureaucracy that would eventually want to debrief her on every aspect of the mission. It was Master Chief Petty Officer Dex Rourke, wearing dress blues and carrying a small wooden box. "Thought you might want this," he said, setting the box on her hospital table. Inside was a piece of twisted metal, painted olive drab, with stenciled numbers still visible despite the crash damage. A fragment of her A-10's fuselage, recovered from the crash site. "The aircraft's a total loss," Rourke continued. "But the crew chief said this was part of the nose section, right behind where your call sign was painted. Figured it belonged to you." Thea turned the metal fragment over in her hands, feeling its weight, remembering the sound it had made when 30 tons of aircraft hit the plateau at 140 knots. Such a small piece of such a large machine, but somehow it contained everything. The storm, the firefight, the impossible decision to turn off her radio and ignore direct orders. "There's something else," Rourke said. "The Navy's recommending you for the Navy Cross. Apparently, saving 8 SEALs in weather conditions that grounded every other pilot in theater qualifies as extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming odds." The Navy Cross, the service's second highest decoration, awarded for exceptional acts of heroism in combat. Thea had seen senior officers build entire careers around less significant achievements. "I don't want it," she said quietly. Rourke raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am." "The medal, I don't want it. Those men would have done the same thing for me. Hell, they proved it when they came to get me out of that plateau. This isn't about heroism. It's about doing the job." The Master Chief was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "With respect, Captain, I've served with a lot of pilots over the years. Good ones, bad ones, brave ones, cowards. What you did up there, that wasn't just doing the job. That was choosing to risk everything for people you'd never met. That's what the job is supposed to be." "Maybe, but most people don't see it that way." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, every man in my unit has put in for a transfer to whatever base you're assigned to next. Figure if we're going to get into trouble again, we want the pilot who actually shows up when she's called." After he left, Thea lay in her hospital bed, holding the piece of metal that had once been part of an aircraft that had carried her through a storm that shouldn't have been survivable to save men who had then saved her in return. The fragment was warm from her body heat, and she could almost hear the ghost of turbofan engines cutting through mountain air. Outside her window, transport aircraft were taking off and landing in perfect weather, carrying supplies and personnel to bases across Europe and the Middle East. Routine missions, milk runs, the kind of flying that built careers and filled logbooks without ever testing the limits of aircraft or aircrew. She missed the storm already. 2 months later, Captain Thea Reaper, Konstantinova, reported for duty at Bagram Airfield, Afghanistan, assigned to the 104th Fighter Squadron. Her reputation had preceded her, the pilot who had ignored direct orders to save 8 Navy SEALs, who had flown a crippled A-10 through impossible weather, who had crashed in hostile territory and fought her way out. Some of her new squadron mates treated her like a legend. Others whispered that she was reckless, dangerous, the kind of pilot who would get people killed with her cowboy mentality. Most just waited to see what she would do next. What she did was exactly what she'd always done. Flew the missions that needed flying, supported the troops that needed supporting, and ignored the people who thought a woman couldn't handle the pressure.